Hey everybody, it's asmrbebexo. Today I decided to do a little throwback type of video, and I'm going to be doing a close-up, soft-spoken reading to you. I'm going to be reading an excerpt to you from the textbook, Introduction to Jazz History, and the cover just looks like this. I'm covering the location of the store I rented it from, but I'm taking a jazz appreciation class in college. I'm not a music major, but I really love and enjoy music. I actually play the acoustic guitar a little bit, and music is just one of those things for me that I love and appreciate so much, and especially jazz music. And I love the jazz music. Sorry, that was my washer shutting off. But especially the jazz music from back in the day. So this is the Introduction to Jazz History textbook, and it goes over the roots of jazz history, some of the major influences and artists of the time. So I'm going to read to you the preface and chapters 1 and 2, because that's what I need to go over for class. And I figured, what better way to study than to make an ASMR video. Also, sorry if this couch is super squeaky, but it's vintage. We actually acquired it from family, and it's creaky, but I really like it. I'm a big hippie, but whatever. Okay, so as I said, this is going to be a soft-spoken reading. A lot of people used to love my whispered readings, but lately here I've gotten a lot more requests for soft-spoken. So part of this class is also listening to selected musical pieces and picking out different aspects of the song and studying that. So I'll talk about that when I get to that part. So here's the preface. If I get to any pictures, I will show you, but I don't think, yeah, there's a couple, not very many. So I hope you enjoy this and maybe learn a little something. I already had this lecture, so I know what I'm going to be talking about, but I'm just kind of going over it and reading to you guys. The people who play jazz create the complexities and individual nuances that make a history of jazz so difficult to formulate. No clear-cut category can encompass all jazz. Each performer's idiom is a style unto itself. If it were not so, the music would hardly be jazz. Jazz, like almost all other music, comprises 3 artistic activities: creating, performing, and listening. In traditional Western European music, these 3 activities are not always performed by the same individual, although they quite often are. In jazz, however, it is necessary for the performer to combine all 3 at the same time. Musical creation is an active part of any jazz performance and depends on the performer's understanding of the developing creation, an understanding gained only by their ability to listen well. They must react instantaneously to what they hear from their fellow performers, and their own contribution must be consistent with the unfolding themes and moods. Every act of musical creation in jazz is, therefore, as individual as the performer creating it. Jazz occupies a unique place in American cultural history. Although it has been influenced by the music of many countries, it remains a purely American phenomenon. And because the creators of jazz, the performers, have been influenced by social and historical forces peculiar to America, an understanding of their life experiences and lifestyles is often essential. It is almost impossible to present a history of jazz without looking closely at its great performers. Although we are concerned mainly with the music itself, the various styles can often be seen to have grown directly out of the substance of the performers' lives, and we have therefore given whatever biographical information is necessary to understand a musician's development. Looking over the historical span of jazz, we cannot say one performer is more important than another, and we have had a difficult time choosing performers to discuss. We have selected certain individuals for special biographical treatment because they stand out as leaders in the development of a particular jazz style. We have necessarily had to exclude a number of significant artists. Furthermore, we have gone into detail in the biographies of some musicians, not because they are more important than others, but because their lives have been bound up with the lives of so many other musicians. Such an approach allows us to examine many interesting interactions between musicians who have determined the direction of jazz over the years. Nevertheless, the subject of this book is jazz, not life histories, and we include biographical detail only to the extent that it illuminates the music. This edition updates several of the ongoing stylistic trends in jazz today, including the strong historical influence of Latin music to modern big bands and salsa bands, bebop, and crossover. The new hybrids of American music have been added to the end of the text. New biographical sketches for recent and historical musicians have been added for balance and to provide background for the discussions of style. The overview appendix on rock has been expanded for a better understanding of its influence on contemporary jazz styles. And the rest of the preface goes on to detail special features and study aids included in the text. And a note to the student: as a student of jazz styles, you must keep one activity foremost in your studies. You must actively listen to the examples and observe the differences that identify each style. Reading and discussion alone will not convey the essence of the various styles. Only listening does, and listening requires total attention. Approach jazz as you would any other serious musical art. Your appreciation of jazz and understanding of its history will be enhanced greatly by continued listening and reading about how jazz styles were born, grew, and changed. And then we have some acknowledgments. So, we're going to go on to chapter 1 now, the good stuff. This chapter is the roots of jazz. We can see some influential figures here, as jazz music is deeply rooted in African and African American culture. So, let's get started. Although jazz emerged as a recognizable form around the turn of the 20th century in the southern United States, its roots extend backward over several centuries. It represents a synthesis of many cultural influences, both musical and non-musical, religious and secular, African and European, that was achieved through the institution of slavery. This synthesis began over 500 years ago when the first black slaves were brought to Europe from West Africa by Portuguese explorers. The synthesis continued as Spanish, French, Dutch, and British merchants entered the slave trade over the next 200 years, selling to plantation and mine owners in the West Indies. Slavery spread to North America in 1619 when the British imported the first blacks to their colonies in Virginia. A slave trade distribution pattern based on the nationalities of sellers and buyers soon developed. The pattern was even more clearly defined by the fact that each trading nation procured slaves from specific factory areas in West Africa. The Portuguese purchased slaves from black rulers in Senegal and sold them in Brazil. The English plundered the Ashantis of the Gold Coast and sold them in North America. The French bought slaves in Dahomey and sold them in Haiti and the Louisiana Territory. Each of these African tribes was a separate cultural entity with its own social customs and religion, and its own music, songs, and instruments. Two factors, one technical and the other sociological, distinguished African from European music. The technical factor was that African rhythms were complex. Several drummers usually performed at the same time, weaving a pattern of contrasting beats and accents. Such complex rhythms, called polyrhythms, had become well established in daily life. The second factor concerns the sociological aspects of African music making. Although most African societies allowed certain gifted individuals to assume a principal role in musical performances, they emphasized mass participation to a far greater degree than did European societies. Everyone within earshot was expected to participate. There were few passive observers. A typical performance would have a leader accompanied by drummers and possibly other instrumentalists who called out rhythmic words or phrases. The participating audience, clapping in time and moving in unison, would shout a response. As the hypnotic beat quickened and became more insistent and persuasive, participants might become possessed, tremble violently, and fall down. African music making was thus a collective experience in which everyone had the opportunity for self-transcendence through music. Although similar give-and-take situations existed in some European religions, where the pastor would quote a passage and the congregation would answer, African societies had brought the art to a higher state. Slaves in the New World colonies adapted these response cries to their work routines and social and religious gatherings. White Americans called them field hollers and shouts, or when performed in a moving circle, ring shouts. Jazz musicians applied the term call response to these plantation songs and later to the blues. The collision of African and European societies in the New World produced distinctive cultural practices that are evident to this day. Foremost was the conflict between language and religion. French, Spanish, and Portuguese Catholic slave owners were more tolerant of native African religious practices than were the puritanical English Protestants. Whereas North American slave owners forbade their slaves to construct or play drums or engage in tribal chants and dances, slave owners in Haiti, Cuba, and Brazil, while urging their slaves to convert to Catholicism, left them relatively free to continue their African rituals and musical practices. Because of the difference in restrictions, slave music evolved in different ways from region to region. Slaves in North America found the simple rhythms and isolated melodies of English ballads and dance tunes strange, but had to adopt them if they were to have any music at all. The slaves in Latin America found Spanish and Portuguese music less alien. The Moorish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula in the 700s, lasting as it did for the next 700 years, had already infused Spanish and Portuguese music with African inflections. The North African Moors themselves had previously assimilated sub-Saharan music through exposure to black Africans brought north in the intercontinental slave trade. Thus, more African sounds survive in Latin American than in North American black music. Western European music also heavily influenced the development of jazz. These early influences came from four areas: church hymns, folk songs and dances, military marches and airs, and classical compositions. Not all forms were present in the Americas when the first slaves were brought over, but each eventually had an effect. The effect differed, however, depending on the African-European cultural mix. In Protestant North America, efforts to impose Christianity and suppress tribal worship led to the emergence of hymn and spiritual singing and the simplification of rhythms. In Latin America and Catholic North America, European music had the most influence on harmony. It might be said that of the three major elements of music, Africa's principal contribution was rhythm, Europe's was harmony, and both furnished melody. However, it was the Afro-Americans who combined all three elements into a whole. So I'm taking a break from reading because I wanted to show you guys my new fur baby. His name is Ginger, and he's such a sweetie. He's a rescue from my mom's place, and we love him so much. He's just a little over a year. He's a good kitty. Hey, buddy. Tell my subscribers hello. He says hi. Next, we will discuss instruments. The amalgamation of styles was not a simple task, considering that the black slave culture had very few instruments at its disposal. With the exception of the banjo, jazz is normally played on instruments of European design. Although African music seems to be dominated by drums and other percussion instruments, it did not lack melody or the instruments for producing it. Different tribes played various kinds of horns, trumpets, and stringed instruments such as the 10 to 14 string guitar-like bandora, the 3-string kunting, the harp-like 18-string koro, and 7-string simbing, the sansa, a thumb piano, and the marimba-like balafute. Another plucked instrument was the banya, which, when reconstructed in America and anglicized, became the banjo. Why then were European instruments used exclusively in jazz? First of all, slaves captured in Africa brought no property. Once ashore, they had little opportunity to make instruments. As was mentioned, they were prohibited from doing so in most cases. Second, African musical scales varied from region to region, and slave musicians tuned their instruments in ways very different from those of Europeans. Therefore, the few Afro-Americans who did get the opportunity to play instruments in military bands or for the entertainment of their masters played European-style music on European instruments. These early marching bands became part of the black social organizations that flourished in the post-Civil War South. The bands, in measured step, would accompany funeral cortèges to grave sites, and then, on the return march, would strike up lively tunes to lift the spirits of the bereaved and joyfully usher the soul of the departed to the gates of heaven. I do apologize if I keep, pausing and losing my place, but the words in this text are so tiny, and I'm holding it behind the camera, so it's hard to read. Musical forms. The spiritual. Slave owners discouraged or prohibited African religious songs and dances, but encouraged the singing of Christian hymns. Hymns, therefore, underwent a transformation at the hands of Afro-Americans. The spiritual, a religious folk song, became an expression of hope for release from oppression and sorrow, if not in this life, at least in the next. Protestant Christianity was introduced into slave life by means of individual and family conversions in the 1600s and early 1700s. Black Protestant congregations began to form around 1780, a date that coincides with the beginning of the Great Awakening, an important religious movement that affected the colonial and frontier states for the next 50 years. Great Awakening activities included camp meetings, which took place in temporary tent communities. They lasted as long as a week at a time and featured traveling preachers, some of whom became quite famous. Both blacks and whites attended, and the Afro-Americans injected their rhythmic style into the frequent mass hymn singing. The songs were primarily folk hymns that were lined out. That is, the preacher would call out a line of the stanza and the congregation would repeat it in song. This procedure was familiar to most blacks. Soon they were composing their own songs of worship. They employed symbolism. They employed symbolism specific to the black situation while using more free-swinging, syncopated melodies full of blue or bent notes. Over the next century, the singing of spirituals spread widely over the southern United States. In 1871, the Jubilee Singers of Fisk College, a black school in Nashville, toured the United States and Europe. Their programs, which included many spirituals, were received enthusiastically and helped establish the spiritual as a valid art form. Before the blues. In addition to spirituals, secular songs dealing with loneliness, infidelity, rootlessness, or repression began to appear. Since most were composed and played by unschooled musicians, they were not written down but passed on orally, as is the case with most folklore. These songs were the forerunners of the common 12-measure blues discussed in Part 1. The blues has been fundamental to the development of jazz. Without it, jazz, if it should exist at all, would be vastly different. Minstrel show music. The interchange of cultural elements between whites and blacks took several curious turns. In the 1840s, white stage companies began presenting minstrel shows. These featured entertainers in blackface performing song, dance, and comedy acts that portrayed blacks as amusing, if not ridiculous, personalities. After the Civil War, Afro-Americans, seeing the popularity of minstrel shows, organized several such companies themselves. To be accepted in southern cities, black showmen and a few women had to make up in blackface too. Thus, a double deception emerged in which blacks imitated whites who imitated blacks. Prominent among the varied minstrel acts was the light-hearted but usually somewhat disparaging coon song. It was sung by the lead vocalist in dialect and took a humorous, if patronizing, view of the black condition. The cakewalk and ragtime. Because Protestant strictures forbade working on Sunday, black slaves were allowed one day at rest. A favorite Sunday amusement among slaves was parodying European dances that they had seen the white gentry performing at balls and socials. These parody dances were accompanied by syncopated tunes played on fiddles and banjos. They usually included a walk-around in which couples would parade around a square and improvise high-stepping, vigorous movements as they turned each corner. These entertainments were often performed before whites and were incorporated later in minstrel shows. Couples who were judged to be the most inventive would receive a prize, often a cake. Thus, the strutting, high-kicking dance to syncopated music became known as the cakewalk. In the 1890s, the cakewalk craze swept the country. Whites from coast to coast cakewalked, and so another double deception occurred, only this case, whites imitated blacks who were mimicking whites. The cakewalk craze may have spurred the composition of piano music with similar rhythms called ragtime. On the other hand, ragtime may have stimulated the cakewalk fad. Whichever form provided the impetus, jazz was not far away. As will be seen in the following chapters, jazz originated from a mixture of African and European music and grew into the sophisticated form it is today. It is uniquely American music, and although it is composed of musical elements drawn from other cultures, it probably could not have developed anywhere but in the United States. Chapter 2 focuses on work songs, and particularly the influence of Huddie Ledbetter, otherwise known as Leadbelly. This chapter is short. Okay, so I talked about actively listening to music, so in this section we will be listening to Huddie Ledbetter's music, particularly the song Juliana Johnson. So let's start with the top. In most pre-literate cultures, work songs have served as a means of coordinating large tasks that require many workers. History does not record exactly when the custom began, but it is likely that in the United States the slaves themselves devised it in the 1600s. When plantation bosses and prison guards saw how effective work songs were, they encouraged their use. On prison work farms and on large plantations where tasks such as pulling up tree stumps, chopping cotton, or hauling heavy loads were common, a lead singer would set the pace by using the rhythm of a song. Most work songs told a simple story, one with which the workers were familiar. The singer would use heavy rhythmic accents, and the workers would join in with shouts or call response at regular intervals throughout the song. The shouts or grunts signaled the moment of coordinated effort. The work songs were kept simple to allow the laborers to concentrate on the work. They were made even more effective by their hypnotic rhythms. When there was no need to coordinate single thrusts or pulls, work songs could take on more ballad-like qualities. Even the slower songs, however, induced the workers to move in smooth flowing motions that paralleled the song's rhythm. The tempo, or rate of speed, of each work song was adjusted to match the speed required for the task. Effective work song leaders were in demand not only because they promoted efficiency, but also because they alleviated worker discontent. There were undoubtedly many locally famous lead singers, but it was not until the advent of the phonograph that one was brought into national and even international prominence. He was discovered in prison by two record talent scouts. His name was Huddie Ledbetter. Ledbetter's rhythmic sense combined with his strong emotional voice made him a valuable asset to any work team. As leader, he received preferential treatment and avoided much heavy prison work. He sang and played while the others sweated. So here's a listening guide for Juliana Johnson that tells you what to listen for. This says Juliana Johnson is an example of Ledbetter's talents. Although there are no workers' responses, one can easily imagine where they would occur. Each verse is divided into two identical parts, and there are only two harmonies for each verse. This is a simpler structure than the standard 12-measure blues progression. The guitar accompaniment is deceptively complex, however. Each strum of the guitar seems to contain only one beat, but Ledbetter actually strums twice. Thus, each measure contains 8 strums. The first complete measure starts on the word Johnson. Notice that the guitar accompaniment contains lead and rhythm elements, as well as an underlying bass line. Ledbetter recorded this song several times, and the text changed each time. So now we discuss Huddie Ledbetter, or Leadbelly, approximated to have been born in 1885 and died in 1949. At an age when today's suburban youngsters are preparing for junior high proms, Huddie Ledbetter was ranging around the Caddo Lake area of Louisiana, attending the numerous Suki jumps and breakdowns that made up nightlife on Saturdays in the rural South. Huddie found these late-night activities exciting and the music fascinating. Not content to be a mere observer, Ledbetter began teaching himself on the only available instrument, the accordion, and soon became, in his estimation, as good as they had on the windjammer. This is excerpted from Frederick Ramsey Jr., December 1953. Born in Mooringsport, Louisiana in 1885, according to the best estimates, Ledbetter went to work on his father's cotton farm at an early age. He was bigger and stronger than other boys his age, which probably contributed to his self-confident and aggressive nature. By age 15, he was working away from home as a field hand, and his undisciplined nature soon led to problems. His habitual pursuit of women brought on a number of confrontations with husbands, parents, and jealous boyfriends. It is said he acquired his nickname Leadbelly after a fight in which it was alleged he had been shot. Leadbelly's life involved a long series of scrapes with the law. The combination of whiskey, an explosive temper, and boundless physical energy was often too much for him to handle. In his youth, he was in and out of prison half a dozen times. Sentenced to chain gangs, he escaped only to get into trouble again. In 1918, while in Texas, serving a 35-year sentence for murder in Sugarland Penitentiary, he struck up a friendship with the warden, who introduced him to the governor. The governor was so impressed by a song beseeching his leniency that he pardoned Huddy in 1925. 7 years later, when he was serving a 6 to 10 year sentence for attempted homicide in Louisiana's Angola State Penitentiary, he got another break. Folklorists John and Alan Lomax, then touring prisons in the hope of discovering unpublished songs, heard Ledbetter and interceded on his behalf with the governor of Louisiana. In 1934, the governor commuted Huddy's sentence. Leadbelly went to New York in 1935 and worked as a chauffeur for the Lomaxes. They sponsored stage and nightclub appearances for Huddy, whose authenticity won him almost instant acclaim. Popularity and financial security could not keep him out of trouble, however. Between 1937 and 1940, he went to jail 2 more times, but after his release in 1940, he managed to avoid any further arrests. His confinements were only inconvenient interruptions in his career. He continued to be a popular entertainer, touring off and on with such well-known performers as Josh White, Big Bill Brunsey, and Woody Guthrie. He collected and remembered a very large number of songs in the years he spent rambling around the South. Historian Frederick Ramsey believes that the blues troubadour Blind Lemon Jefferson, who was 12 years younger than Ledbetter, exerted a significant influence on his musical style. Leadbelly made many recordings, including some touching performances before children who seemed to see a tenderness in him that his prison record would belie. But he had trouble working in studio situations. More than once, recording companies refused to continue working with him because of the excessively long time it took to make an acceptable cut. Huddy's appeal began to fade during World War II, and in the ensuing years he found few audiences for his music. In Paris in 1949, a degenerative disease of the nervous system, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which had been gradually overtaking him, finally caught up to him. He was brought back to the United States virtually paralyzed. Leadbelly died in New York on December 6, 1949. And this is a stylistic timeline that shows instrumental and vocal styles evolving from jazz, starting with the blues, and what years they were predominant in, if you're interested. You can pause it and take a screenshot if you really want to know. But that is all for the first 2 chapters. I feel like we covered more in class than was included in those chapters, but it's probably because my professor added to the text. Anyway, I'm sorry for being a little scrambled in the head during that and messing up a lot of words and slowing down. I'm really tired and I've been working really hard with school, so I'm getting used to the whole routine, so I should be able to make more videos here soon. I wanted to make something to hold you guys over. I really hope that you enjoyed this, and I will see you in my next video. Have a great night or day.